As we go to North Andover, Massachusetts, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Well, Professor Chomsky, good afternoon. I'm honored to ask you a question.
Here's Noam Chomsky about to be asked a question on Edward Bernays, often credited as the father of propaganda. There's so many interesting aspects to what Chomsky elaborates on here, but for me the notion that Bernays believed the masses needed to be controlled for their own benefit is one of the most startling. In some ways, what's detailed is an extreme nanny state, guiding the general public as if they're too stupid to be trusted.
I have... When you said to us the grandson that you were able to enjoy a baseball game with last week, with your love of words and your love of linguistics, I was just curious if you ever had the opportunity to have any connection with Mr. Edward L. Bernays, who was a resident of Cambridge for the last 40 years of his life, was first in New York City, and was for almost 100 years connected with, very powerfully, the public affairs work of the American Tobacco Company, working with Guatemala for a war that almost was started because of bananas in the 50s, and all of these different media actions that I believe have really contributed to where we are now in our worldview of, we have got a corporate mentality of destroying what we don't like, taking it over, manipulation of it, because his learning from his uncle, Sigmund Freud, was utilized to his best ability with twisting people's view of what was good for them, so that he could sell products to them.
Thanks, caller. Eddie Bernays.
Actually, I never, you're right, he lived in Cambridge. We weren't that far apart. I never actually met him. But,
called the father of public relations.
Yeah. But I've written a fair amount. I've looked at a lot of his work, and in fact have written a fair amount about it. I suspect that it wasn't his Freud who was the big influence on him, but rather, in fact, exactly what he said. He said the major influence on him was his participation in the first state propaganda agency in the United States, Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, which was established in order to try to drive a basically pacifist population into support for the war that Wilson very much wanted to get into in Europe. And it succeeded. Within a short period of time, the propaganda efforts, they were called propaganda in those days, it was more honest use of terminology. The propaganda efforts of the Committee on Public Information, a very Orwellian name, did succeed in driving a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics, to the point where the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, things like that. It drove the country into a kind of hysteria. And the participants in that committee included many people of subsequent great distinction and influence. Edward Bernays was one. Another was Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and most important figure in American media. Both of them went through that experience and learned from it, and wrote about what they learned from it. What they learned, as Bernays put it in a famous book of his called Propaganda, late 1920s, I think, he said that we have learned that the intelligent minorities can engineer consent through the use of manipulation, propaganda, and control. And we should do it for the benefit of the public. It's for the benefit of the public that we should control them and engineer their consent. Lippmann said pretty much the same thing. Also drawing from the experience of the wartime propaganda agency, he wrote important essays on democracy in the 1920s called Progressive Essays in Democracy. They were both liberals, kind of Wilsonian progressives. He said, well, we've learned that there's a new art in the practice of democracy, the art of what he called manufacturing consent. Bernays' term was engineering of consent. And this is very significant because the public should not be participants in the democratic process. They should be spectators, not participants. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, as he put it. And for their own benefit, we, the intelligent minority, the responsible men, must control them. Bernays' particular significance, this had all sorts of influence all over the place, but in the intellectual culture, in political science, and so on. But Bernays' particular influence was exactly as you say, he was one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, which grew into a massive industry right at that period. It had existed before, but it became very important after at this time. And its goal was to control attitudes, beliefs, to marginalize people, to induce, to drive them towards what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and keep them out of the public arena where they don't belong. Bernays' first major achievement was a program that convinced women to smoke cigarettes. Women didn't smoke in those days, but he had an elaborate public relations program, including models walking down Fifth Avenue, to show, with cigarettes, showing this is what modern women are like. And it did succeed in turning women into smokers with a toll that we need not discuss.
Click here for Chomsky on Idiots in Power.